The 1960 presidential election was truly a historical event. The candidates consisted of Republican candidate Richard Nixon, who was former President Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president, and Democrat candidate John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts. It was the first time Alaska and Hawaii participated in a presidential election, having been granted statehood in the previous year, and it was also the first election in which both candidates running for president were born in the 20th century. The electoral vote was the closest in any presidential election since 1916, and Kennedy's margin of victory was the closest ever in American history. To this day, the 1960 election remains a source of debate among some historians as to whether or not voting theft in selected states aided Kennedy's victory. In fact, one of the closest races was in the state of Kentucky. This prompts the question, what role did Kentucky play in the 1960 election? In the 1960 election, the two candidates were drastically different in their political opinions. Kentucky favored Nixon over Kennedy, so much so they demanded a recount. Although they never received it, they remained a conservative state, which can be shown through various polls.
The 1960 election was a battle between both Nixon and Kennedy. Headlines were calling the election before the results were conclusive, causing much confusion and irritation. The election was known as the closest election in history. As it is known, Kennedy won, becoming the 35th president of the United States. An exhausted Nixon was over the election and just wanted a break. However, Nixon's fellow constituents insisted on a recount. Nixon wanted nothing to do with it as, quote, he thought contesting it would do a great harm to the country, end quote. Leonard Hall, Nixon's campaign manager, and Kentucky Senator Thruston Morton, quote, urged Nixon to demand a recount, end quote. They believed there was voting fraud in at least 8 states, and they wanted to shut it down. They created a team and sent out multiple people to Illinois, New Jersey, Texas, Missouri, New Mexico, Nevada, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania to figure out the truth. Although they were unable to uncover the fraud in most of the states, they found crucial information on Texas and Illinois. Quote, for instance, in Fannin County, which had 4,895 registered voters, 6,138 votes were casted, 3/4 of them for Kennedy. In one precinct in Anglia County, 86 people voted, and the final tally was 147 for Kennedy, 24 for Nixon, end quote. In the end, there was not an official recount, and the decision for Kennedy to be president stood. Although the two of them failed to receive a recount, Morton and Hall contributed tremendously to uncovering the truth of vote fraud. Although Kentucky might be a small state, there are some pretty mighty people.
John F. Kennedy was a man of firsts when it came to his presidency. He was the youngest person to be elected and was the first Catholic. Televised debates were also a first during this election. Although the race was close, the debates enabled Kennedy to get the final few votes. The audience was able to see his charismatic personality and charm. However, that was not the only contributor to Kennedy's win. Foreign policy opinions differed between the two. Nixon believed that since Republicans had been in office the previous 8 years, Soviet power had remained contained. Kennedy argued by illustrating foreign policy during the time that Eisenhower was in power as inert. He especially played on the fact that Republicans lost to Cuba and allowed a missile gap to develop. The Soviet Union was then able to overtake the U.S. in building missiles that are capable of nuclear war. Kennedy promised he would change the response system to be more flexible so events of the past did not occur again. Even though Kennedy won, some of Nixon's critiques were proven true. Kennedy was overwhelmed during the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, the rage of Nikita Khrushchev, and the construction of the Berlin Wall. Kennedy persevered through these events and still made a meaningful impact on the country.
On the website U.S. Election Atlas, lots of statistics regarding the presidential election of 1960 in Kentucky were given. It shows the candidates as well as their vice presidential candidates, popular vote number and percentage, as well as which county in Kentucky voted Republican or Democratic. This source is very helpful to our question because it compares the Republican and Democratic statistics side by side. The Republican candidate Richard Nixon received 602,607 votes, while his Democratic counterpart received only 521,855 votes. This win for Nixon gained him 10 Electoral College votes in the overall election. However, JFK still beat him, again proving that the state of Kentucky had little impact overall in the election.
I first introduced myself and Mr. Snow, my old high school AP US history teacher. I continued to ask him what voting was like in the 60s. As expected, the polls were mostly dominated by whites. His response proves this idea.
Definitely easier for whites, but difficult for African Americans in the South. The polls were mainly dominated by whites due to the lack of the rights given to African Americans. But the African Americans made an effort to have their voice be heard.
I then went on to ask him if he thought Kentucky was more of a liberal or conservative state during that time, and if Kentucky has changed their political view. He begins to give reasoning as to why Kentucky is conservative and has continued to be conservative.
Back in the 60s, I would say it was a conservative yet also democratic state. However, it leaned more toward conservative in most counties. Actually, my mother's father was the only person in Casey County to openly vote for JFK, and she and her siblings were openly attacked at school. Now, Kentucky is 100% conservative. Kentucky is a red state, and that is definitely shown through this past election with Trump.
Lastly, I asked him what was going on during that time that would maybe persuade voters to a certain party.
The Brown versus Board of Education decision, the decision to end segregation in schools, enraged whites, that definitely made them want to vote because they did not want African Americans in their schools. Also, tobacco and coal were really big and still are, so that is mostly what persuaded voters.
In this photograph, a group of JFK supporters awaited his arrival at the University of Kentucky on one of Kennedy's campaign stops in 1960. On the left, there's a sign mocking Kennedy's Republican opponent, Richard Nixon, showing that they are all in favor of Kennedy becoming the next president. This picture is relevant to our research question because it shows a large group of Kentuckians from all ages supporting Kennedy as a candidate in the election of 1960. Although Nixon beat Kennedy in Kentucky, JFK still had a strong backing of citizens, showing that despite Kentucky being historically a Republican-sided state, the race was fairly close, being split 46% to 53% between the two candidates. Since Kennedy ultimately won the election, Kentucky proved to have little impact in the overall election.
In this photograph, it shows a picture of John F. Kennedy in Lexington, Kentucky during his campaign run during the 1960 election. In this image, it shows the joy that people had meeting and seeing John F. Kennedy. If you look closer at the image, the smiles are prevalent throughout the crowd. This shows the effect that JFK had on many people, and this was the same for many people in multiple cities across the nation. Although Nixon won the state of Kentucky in the end, the overall impact that John F. Kennedy had on the state of Kentucky was big enough to help him win the election. Considering Kentucky is a predominantly Republican state, the fact that he was able to get so many votes shows how impactful him and his campaign really were.
The image above highlights the election results in all of the states in the U.S. According to 270 to Win, the three presidential candidates in the 1960 election were John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and Harry Byrd. Both Kennedy and Byrd were the Democrat candidates, and Nixon was the Republican candidate. Looking at this map, although it looks like Richard Nixon won more states, Kennedy won more electoral votes, therefore winning the 1960 presidential election. This image contributes to our research question because it shows the outcome of the voting in the states and how it affected the results of the presidential election. We can also use this map to predict the outcomes of the state of Kentucky for future presidential elections. The second photo represents the election results of the most recent presidential election in 2016. We can make some comparisons and see some similarities in both of the maps. Although many of the other states have changed throughout the years, Kentucky has remained a, quote, red state, or a state that usually votes for the Republican Party. With this information, we can assume that Kentucky will remain a red state for the next few elections to come. I interviewed Callie Pulse, a political science major here at the University of Kentucky. I first asked Callie what she thought voting was like in the 1960s.
I think it was probably similar to the same as it is today, but most likely more difficult for Black people to vote because of segregation.
I then asked Callie if she believes Kentucky was a more liberal or conservative state during the 1960 elections, and if she believes it has changed.
I'm guessing it was conservative and most likely hasn't changed.
Finally, I asked Callie what was going on in Kentucky during the time of the elections that would have persuaded voters to vote in a certain way.
I'm not sure, but there was probably a lot going on with desegregation, considering a lot was going on in the 1960s.